The government has continued to find itself embroiled in a row over Chinese spies. The West Midlands Police have banned Tel Aviv supporters from an Aston Villa European game, and the Green Party's Zack Polanski is impressed. And in this week's podcast, we're doing a special question time as well. So I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
It worked.
So welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock, and Joe Phillips. And let's start with that China story, because last week we were saying that we didn't think the government were going to get into too many difficulties in respect of this story. So just to remind listeners, this is a spy case that was going through the courts and was a sort of 11th hour dropped by the CPS. And the CPS have claimed subsequently that that was because the government weren't prepared to give evidence that they thought they needed to get a prosecution. The row continued this week at Prime Minister's questions, where Kemi Badenoch basically threw a very soft toy at Keir Starmer, who very easily battered it away and then battered her around the head, because once again, what the leader of the opposition had failed to do was prepare for Keir Starmer to pull the rug from under her, which of course he did immediately at PMQs by announcing that he would release all of the letters and correspondence and minutes relating to that particular issue. Kemi Badenoch proceeded to ask questions about whether he would release those letters, and he's already answered the question, but that's another story. Let me just ask you guys, start with you, if I may, Jim. Do we think the government are in any difficulties, genuine difficulties, over this China situation, or do we think that the spotlight is beginning to turn on the DPP and the Crown Prosecution Service?
No, I think the government could still be in trouble. I mean, the old adage that comes from our friend Alistair Campbell is if you want to kill off a story, you need to do it fairly promptly. Otherwise, if it's got legs and goes on for 10 days or more, you're in trouble. And I think the revelations in the letters and the impression that's been given over the last few days might give Kemi Badenoch another chance to have a go at Keir Starmer, and hopefully she'll make a better fist of it than she did last week. I just think that we can go into all the details of this, but it just feels to me that the three letters that were published, one before the general election and two afterwards, and just to make a nerdy little point, there was some confusion for a while as to whether the second letter was under the Conservative government and started to refer to our need to have good economic relations with China, when in fact both were under the Labour government. So you see in the progress of the letters this need to refer to this in these supporting documents. But the big question is, when you charge people, you normally establish crucially beforehand the likelihood of a successful prosecution. Otherwise, you're wasting taxpayers' money. That's the argument. So why this need for extra evidence afterwards? And, one is compelled to the view that it's a delicate relationship we have, but it seems to me that the impression was given the big meeting that was held on the 1st of September in the presence of Jonathan Powell, Keir Starmer's key aide, and others, that the impression must have been given to the prosecutors that the government wanted this done. There's even been a suggestion, the very last paragraph, which is a direct paste from the Labour manifesto, saying that we need to recognise China presents challenges but opportunities. The direct pasting of that is an indication from Collins, this guy who had to draw up this information, that he was being, I'm doing this because this is what the government wants. So I just think that that's what people are going to feel that this was dropped. I mean, because it was going to be awkward, and then all the questions about our relations with China unfold, and we got this delicious problem of the Chinese embassy. What the government are going to do about that now, it's going to be massively under the spotlight.
I think it demonstrates again the lack of political instinct of the government, though, as well, doesn't it? Because actually, the simple thing to have done with this case would have been to say there is no public interest for this case to go forward. And you can apply all sorts of things to that. And basically, you can bat away questions on the basis of public interest rather than get yourselves embroiled in a tit-for-tat conversation and discussion and argument about what the previous government did and what this government did, and then subsequently say, well, it was always up to the CPS anyway. I do think the DPP has questions to answer because, as you say, Jim, if charges are brought, why are you seeking further evidence anyway? And surely the thing to do in that position is to take the issue to trial and let the jury decide. That's what the jury system is for. So I can't quite get my head around where the DPP is coming from. Joe, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, pretty much the same as Jim's. I mean, and I think that the DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, and the Crown Prosecution Service have largely escaped any scrutiny, while Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer are, throwing soft toys at each other. I mean, I think, if you haven't got a watertight case, then you can't take it to court. If it's only watertight dependent on a statement that you may or may not get, it shouldn't go to court. Or, as you say, Frank, you take it to court, let a jury decide. I mean, there are various questions around this. And I think, there is a sense, as you both say, that the government will go, oh, well, there's a cover-up, obviously, whilst they're ordering something else from Amazon that was made in China. So there is a huge hypocrisy. There's also, I think the bigger issue, actually, although it's not as sexy, perhaps, is the Chinese embassy, which would be the biggest embassy in Europe. Massive building right next to Tower Hill in London, Tower Bridge in London, within all eavesdropping distance or telephone wire distance of the Bank of England. But the whole China thing, I was on 5 Live on Saturday night, and Felicity Hannah said, it's like slow horses meet Sir Humphrey. Yes, Minister, isn't it? And I thought that was a really good description, because you've got this absolute sort of what sounds like an exciting spy story. But over the weekend, there was somebody in one of the papers saying, the information that these blokes allegedly passed on to China was pretty easy to get hold of and was fairly low level stuff anyway. So it's not like Kim Philby, for goodness sake, or Anthony Blunt. You've got 2 blokes who are sort of relatively connected, got some Chinese mates, passing on stuff that may or may not have been of interest. But it certainly wasn't, nuclear capability or anything. It was the sort of stuff that any of us could find quite easily. It's one of those things where you sort of think, oh, there's more to this than meets the eye. And the Tories are desperately trying to wash their hands of it. But of course, it started while they were in government. And I think, you're absolutely right. Yet again, we've seen a lack of political acumen from the government, not seeing that this was going to come. As soon as it was dropped, there must have been, hang on a minute, how's that going to look? What's the answer? What's the reason? And as usual, it's rumbled on, and it's become, only pushed off the front pages by Prince Andrew.
Yeah, I think that the other thing that we should remind ourselves is the voters don't give a toss about this, right?
Exactly.
It's not cutting through at all with the electorate. And so I'm not sure whether this is the thing that the Conservatives ought to be exercised over, but it tends to be the sort of issue that politicians and commentators do get worked up about. And as Jim said, it can unravel very quickly. And the thing that would be really damaging to the government would be if Jonathan Powell got caught up in this, Jim. That's the thing that the government are worried about. This isn't going to bring down Keir Starmer, I wouldn't have thought, but if Jonathan Powell went, that would be another key player out of his administration, and a key player who, by all accounts, has been one of the more impressive performers within the administration.
Yes, and has a long history of working for Tony Blair, and he's an accomplished diplomat. It depends really on whether we can whether the meeting on the 1st of September, which he attended, was minuted, and whether those minutes could come in the public domain. There'd be all sorts of things about the Official Secrets Act and things like that. To it's a question of evidence. Now, obviously, we must say that these two gentlemen who are not being prosecuted now deny any wrongdoing. But there was this thing at the weekend that one of them had brought money in a suitcase back from China, and that their contact in China was a pretty high level.
£4,000. Again, yeah. I think it does demonstrate the value of whatever secrets they'd taken back if it was £4,000.
Yeah, yeah. But
I think that Francesca gets that for just producing this podcast.
And more.
I very much doubt that my experience of the way you run downtown, Frank. But we mustn't get diverted onto that subject today. It isn't. But I mean, the thing that's really you can see how exercised the speaker is about this. The fact that these two people were attached to Tom Tugendhat and Alicia Cairns, who were harsh critics of China, and it's this sort of low-level sort of undermining of these people. It's really sensitive because a lot of these MPs have been sanctioned. This is why it's got this sort of explosive power within Westminster. But that may, as you say, not bother the British public at all. It's just added to other things. When the government's in general difficulty, let me put it like that, they could do without this.
Yeah, for sure. Just on the broader point in terms of Britain's place in the world, though, and this is the problem, isn't it? You've got Donald Trump doing things on his domestic agenda, and I would suggest his meeting with Zelensky over the weekend, that ordinarily a British Prime Minister would be fairly outraged about. You've got China, who we can't be as critical of as we ordinarily would be, because we're a small island, self-isolated from the rest of Europe. Economically, we are reliant on these new superpowers that have emerged, India included now. So where do we go, really? On a pragmatic level, how do we say to China, well, we are going to condemn you and we're going to put all our eggs into the American basket, Joe? It doesn't seem to be a particularly sensible approach. And so whoever is in government are going to have these same challenges, aren't they, as to how far you go to compromise with the Chinese, and how much we think their biggest embassy in Europe is going to make much of a difference as to how they eavesdrop on us anyway, because the sophistication of the techniques that spies have nowadays, and we should always remind ourselves as well, shouldn't we, in these situations, guess what? We do have spies ourselves who are trying to eavesdrop on China, Russia, America, France. We're China, the bastards, they're trying to find out what we're doing. Well, guess what, guys? We do exactly the same. So I just wonder, Joe, what the tactics ought to be, because this whole new golden era of relations with China, and then subsequently, of course, all the Russian money that flooded into the UK, this did come from a Conservative administration.
Absolutely. I mean, when Boris Johnson was mayor of London, he welcomed Russian money coming into the capital, and an awful lot of empty properties and a lot of properties that would not have otherwise been built were funded by Russian money. And nobody lives in them, even though there's a massive waiting list of people who desperately need housing. So, yes, there's all of that. And over, centuries, we have had alliances with various other countries, and then we've fallen out with them. I mean, we are part of the Five Eyes security system, but, there are real genuine questions about the the trustworthiness, if you like, of America with Trump and Pete Hegseth and, you know, the rest of his crew. Can we trust them not to give that information to Russia or to somebody else? And, you know, while we're talking about China, nobody's mentioning India, you know, and we are codependent on many of these countries. And as you rightly say, Frank, you know, we are a tiny little island. You know, we're certainly not punching above our weight. We are, you know, bantamweight at the moment. But we do need to be a little bit more sensible and a little bit more mindful. And I think, you know, Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker of the Commons, is absolutely right to be exercised about this. But there needs to be stricter security about people who get to work in Parliament. You know, it's utterly ridiculous. I know so many people, as I'm sure you both do, who've got passes because they work for a peer who's 497 and hasn't been seen in the House of Commons since Jim was a cub reporter.
Yeah, exactly.
Can
I
I
go
just
back to this security issue? Let's remind ourselves of, you mentioned the guy's name there, Peter Hesketh, and his Telegram text.
Well,
I mean, the Chinese don't have to work hard to find out what the West is up to, actually.
Can I
Jim, sorry.
just a tiny point on your question about you know, what do we do about a world where we've got a fairly aggressive China and a completely unreliable United States? If only there was an organization not too far away from our shores of about 27 countries that are now waking up to their defense responsibilities and are therefore going to become robust militarily, have a huge internal market. If only there was that sort of opportunity for this country. But, you know, sadly, I'm being facetious, because we're beginning to see the Chancellor belatedly, I know that's Frank's view, but the Governor of the Bank of England now explicitly saying that we are 4 points GDP worse off every year because we left the European Union. And I'm somewhat encouraged to see some honesty being portrayed now. In all seriousness, I know it's not the full answer to the might of China and the might of the United States, Frank, but it would be handy if we took our part, and we would take a major part now, particularly with the current weakness of France and to a lesser extent Germany. Just imagine if we were there now, we would be leading the European Union.
Yeah. Oh, well, we all agree on that point.
Yeah.
Jim, I think the final thing I'll say on the Chinese issue, and we'll see whether this has legs or not, because by next weekend, if it's still running as a story, then, as Jim suggested earlier, it will continue to rumble on, I guess. But it is this. Once you get yourself into these deep relations with a country such as China, some of the things, the infrastructure, for example, that they own in the UK now, it's pretty incredible, actually. We've still got Russian influence in terms of the financial and property markets of London, no question about that. And to unravel that is extremely difficult. And it's even more complex and complicated because of the geopolitical situation we find ourselves, particularly with the guy who's currently running the White House. So I don't think it's as easy for Keir Starmer, or if she was in number 10, Kemi Badenoch, to be saying, well, actually, we're just going to rip up these plans for a new Chinese embassy, and we're just going to be really, really tough with Xi Jinping and with people who we ordinarily would have seen as countries we needed to treat carefully. Let's put it that way. So I just think that we are in a very, very difficult position at this moment in time as far as foreign affairs are concerned. And if this issue does ultimately derail the government, then good luck to whoever takes over from this lot, because I think they're going to have exactly the same sort of challenges. Moving on to another issue, which of course is related to foreign affairs, and this was the ban that was announced this week. Aston Villa due to play a European game against a team from Israel. Let me get the name right. It's Maccabi Tel Aviv. And I know that, Jim, you are most upset by this decision by the West Midlands Police Force.
Well, I just think that, let me say, first of all, some Maccabi Haifa fans did misbehave in Amsterdam, taunting the Muslim community there last year in a European match. But the look of Jewish fans not being able to go to a match in this country is unacceptable. And I mean, I imagine talks are going on now, and the West Midlands Police will be able to name their price for doing it. But I imagine a major plan is now being put in place because the Prime Minister has intervened, and I have a feeling that this decision will be reversed. But it'll be a massive policing operation in order to allow the match to go ahead and for the Maccabi fans to come. I mean, this all comes. The reason why this has really exploded is following the tragedy in Manchester and the emergence by the Jewish community, who had to some extent kept their head down since the Gaza war started, just saying what it's been increasingly like to be a Jew in Britain, and it's quite unacceptable. The idea that children have to be protected, Jewish children have to be protected going to school, guards outside synagogues and all this sort of thing. They are not responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, which we all have been horrified by the scenes in Gaza. But this, in my opinion, this has to go ahead. I mean, there are huge issues about this, and this has arisen in the context of the weekly demonstrations in London, which use huge police resources, which are not being deployed on other things that we want dealt with. But in my opinion, the rule of law has to prevail, and whatever it takes. And I mean, I know Villa Park. It's quite a tricky area to police, surrounded by residential accommodation, and it's obviously going to inconvenience the residents there. But in my opinion, that the match does have to go ahead with fans from both sides. And just one gentle point, obviously it's absolutely right to refer to the small element of Maccabi fans, and I'm sure they've been detailed by the intelligence services and will be prevented from coming. But also there have been some quite unacceptable threats from some of the religious leaders in Birmingham about how these fans cannot be allowed to be free of the guilt of the Israeli government, and clear intentions on the part of some of the Gaza protesters to make life extremely difficult. I don't think in the media that's been given quite enough attention, because when I first heard about it, I thought it was Aston Villa fans going to be attacking the Jewish fans, and of course it's not that. And so we have to realize that one of the reasons for the apprehension of the safety board is the threats that have been made by Gaza protesters as what they're going to do to prevent the Jewish fans going to the match.
I don't think it's helped at all in terms of the announcement being made, because it does allow football to be used as, forgive the pun, apolitical football. Tommy Robinson has now said, well, I'm going to attend the game. Going to ban me, and this is the problem you get into, Joe, isn't it? When you start to interfere in these sort of things. So it's easy hindsight, I suppose, but my view on this would have been, well, we'll have to beef up security on the day of the game. Of course we will. But that happens at most football games.
Well,
anyway.
Exactly. And all of us are, old enough and have been going around football games for long enough to know how awful it used to be. I mean, I had a West Ham season ticket, West Ham, Millwall, those matches were absolutely dreadful. And, the intercity firm and all of that stuff, nobody went to watch football, they went to have a fight. So, 'twas ever thus to a certain extent. It's interesting, isn't it?
How did you used to get on, Joe?
I was only interested in the football. Thank you very much.
West Ham Ultra.
Come on, if you're hard enough. But Tommy Robinson, interestingly, has been invited to Israel by the Israeli government. I think that tells you a lot, doesn't it? But I think, this is a very difficult issue, because once politicians at Westminster level get involved in local policing, there are always problems. And it's something that they should avoid at all possible opportunity. However, it does appear that Shabana Mahmood, for whom I have a lot of time as Home Secretary and potential leader of the Labour Party, was told in passing by the Chief of West Midlands Police that, there were problems and stuff like that. Now, We weren't there. We don't know what was said, whether it was sort of on the way out of the door, yeah, we've got problems, but don't worry, we'll sort it out. But actually, there's a point where if they thought there was a real problem, they should have got on the phone to the Home Secretary and said, we think there's a problem, we might need some reinforcements, can you help us? And not allow it to become what is essentially victim blaming, preventing Jewish, are we going to say that no Americans can ever go to a concert in this country because we all hate what Trump's doing? Or you could pick on any country in the world that you disagree with. But it's interesting to note that the Tel Aviv derby match between Tel Aviv Maccabi and Hopel was abandoned because of violence and flares and smoke bombs being thrown on the pitch over the weekend. So, I don't think necessarily that those travelling fans are perhaps the best advertisement for peaceful football. As English fans abroad have been appalling over the years.
We've been banned. I mean, that was the other point that somebody did make over the weekend. They said, forget the fact that this is an Israeli club. Yeah. If these fans were from Germany or from Holland or from Italy, then you could make exactly the same argument. And of course, as if to reinforce that argument, over the weekend, the Israeli authorities themselves banned the Tel Aviv derby because the fans can't behave themselves. There were violent riots, so the game was called off. So I think, again, all of these things tend to be far more complex and complicated than they first appear. But the messaging around this was awful, because it did seem to many people, myself included, that what the West Midlands Police were saying wasn't that the Tel Aviv fans were going to create a security issue for Brummies, but the people in Birmingham were going to be a security threat to those fans. And therefore, that communication of its own volition was absolutely appalling. And therefore, of course, the Home Office and the Prime Minister are going to intervene. If we can't say to people who are visiting our country, yeah, you can come to the UK and you're going to be safe, then that is a sorry state of affairs. That was the big issue, I think, Jim.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I do take your point about banning ultras from various European countries, but there, to some extent, you cannot ignore the political context of this. No. And it's extremely sensitive what Jewish people are able to do in this country at the moment, and that's what the situation is. And I hope that the authorities will be able to screen out the Maccabi ultras, if you want to put it like that, the fans that really misbehave, and allow and there won't be that many. I mean, we're not talking about Inter Milan or something. I mean, Maccabi
600 people, Jim. I mean, it's nothing. It's not huge crowds.
No, but there could be huge crowds of Gaza protesters,
and
that's what the West Midlands. I mean, it's not going to be an easy task, and it's going to cost a fortune now. And of course, as you say, Tommy Robinson's coming, and the whole thing's now escalated because there wasn't, as Frank says, a quiet word with the Home Secretary, and they could have, made the plans for the increased security without hyping it up to this level, which will only make the situation even worse now. And I'm sorry for the residents who live near Villa Park, because they're going to have an uncomfortable couple of days of restrictions.
Yeah, unfortunate and not well handled. And how many times have we said that over the past couple of years in terms of our politicians? Right, final thing on the first part of the programme, I'm going to talk about Zack Polanski and the Green Party, because in our office, as some people will know, downtown in business, we have some very talented young people who are under the age of 30, and they were telling me on Friday how impressed they'd been, Francesca, our producer, being one of them, with Polanski's performance on Question Time, where apparently took on the panel very ably and was able to explain clearly why he thought a wealth tax was the way in which we could solve our economic problems. And all in all, gave a very articulate and very impressive performance. I have watched some of the edited highlights, and I have to agree with my colleagues in the office that it was a good performance. And the membership of the Green Party has spiked significantly since Polanski's election. The poll numbers haven't moved that much, but they potentially could. And what I do think is positive about this is that it will give the government, the Labour Party, reason to consider their policy positioning in the future, because I think that they've been far too keen to tag to the right whenever reform starts to get a little bit of a lot of publicity about some of their pronouncements. And therefore it's good to have a populist left, Joe, who, a voice that appears to be getting plenty of headlines, plenty of publicity. On Question Time, as I say, last week he was on the News Agents podcast on Friday. So I think this could be a positive thing for us.
Yes, I agree up to a point, Lord Copper. It is refreshing to have a different voice, for sure. And Zack Polanski has got that sort of charismatic, good communication skills. He's quite a rabble rouser. He's obviously very attractive to some people. I think he will equally repel some of the perhaps more middle of the road, environmentally progressive people, because there are some things that he's come out with that sound frankly quite bonkers, and the fact that the Greens banned women from their conference because they only wanted to support the sort of trans issues, and that he wants to ban landlords. I'm not entirely sure how you absolutely just ban landlords. So I think there are lots of questions there, but he is a refreshing face, and it's nice that the Greens have got one leader instead of two. And you're absolutely right. Yes, he will cut in to the support that may or may not exist for Jeremy Corbyn, if indeed Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana get their act together and have a party with a name, or no party, or it's my party and you can't come, or whatever it is. So I think that is quite interesting. But I think it is, what I don't get from Polanski is any sense of where they are on the environment. And given that that is the stick with which the Tories and Reform are beating Ed Miliband about the cost of net zero, and lots of people in the country are going, oh, blimey, well, my bills are going up, it's all because of wind farms. I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about what they've got to say on environmental issues, on things like house building and on planning and protecting nature, which is where they sort of belong. But, yes, it's to be welcomed, and yes, it's good. Labour need to look at it and not automatically tap right.
His argument against that particular point, Joe, because I did listen to part of his interview with Lewis Goodall on the News Agents podcast, is that people know where the Greens stand on the environment. The clue is in the name of the party. Now, I think up to a point. I think that's right. But I also get where he's coming from, because the issue that is exercising most people at the moment is cost of living. And so he was saying the economy is the thing that I want to start to get the Greens right in the middle of in terms of the conversation, the discussion. And not only is he articulate, he's somebody who can create that framework of an argument where even skeptics like me can see where he's coming from. And I think Jimmy gives Farage a run for his money in terms of being someone who may be able to grab the headlines from time to time.
Yeah, he's certainly very charismatic. The question is going to be, I know you say Labour are frightened of this, but they're frightened possibly for a good reason. I don't know. Polanski claims to be working with these millionaires for fair tax. You may be a member yourself, Frank. These people who actually believe in paying more tax. But I think they're thin on the ground, quite frankly. There's 1% on assets above 10 million, 2% on assets over $1 billion. he says it will raise £25 billion. He was asked by Victoria Derbyshire, who was standing in and did an excellent job yesterday on the Laura Kunzberg programme. By the way, well, I know we're going to come on to television production issues later. I just can't get around how they run the credits at the beginning of the programme and Laura Kunzberg walking on in a pink suit, and then it's Victoria presenting the programme. Surely they can afford different credits. But, he wants capital gains tax in line with income tax. It would be it's a different sort of Britain. The Conservatives obviously were always sort of capitalist friendly, and Labour, always have to do this tightrope walk about this. I'm not sure what sort of message it will send out to our wealth creators and entrepreneurs if the Green Party really start to gain momentum. And just to say that there is another champion for the Green cause, Ed Miliband was on Victoria Derbyshire Kunzberg programme yesterday, and I thought did a really good job. He's much improved as I really lost contact with him, but he was putting forward vigorously his green agenda, including putting huge solar panels on a section of Lincolnshire and saying, we've got to do it somewhere. And he presented his case with considerable conviction. So, and we must remember that he refused to be moved in this rather disastrous reshuffle. So it looks as if Polanski's energized Miliband on this green agenda, but I'm not sure that Rachel Reeves is going to be, or the Labour Party are going to, come off their cautious approach to capitalism because of this.
I would just make one point.
Sorry.
Of course, Jim. No, just very quickly, that there were a slew of by-elections around Surrey last week, and the Lib Dems took 7 out of 10 seats, including one from the Greens. And I think that's quite interesting because, if membership's going up, that's fine. And one would assume that the Greens automatically and Zack Polanski would appeal to younger voters, and anything that engages young people in politics is a good thing as far as I'm concerned. But I thought it was quite significant that in leafy Surrey, the Lib Dems took a seat from the Greens.
I think they would say that they are looking to gain more support in urban areas.
Yeah.
And in cities such as Liverpool, Birmingham, Leeds, Manchester, that's where they may get some support. And I absolutely take your point, Jim, in terms of the economics being way to the left of anything that we've seen, apart from reform. Because the case that Mel Stride, your mate, made against Nigel Farage and his mates at the Conservative Party conference was that the fantastical economic policies of reform had not been scrutinised one iota by the media. And isn't it strange that we know all about what the Greens' policies are and how they would strangle enterprise and how it will frighten off every millionaire and billionaire, and yet reforms policies, where I think they were basically spending about 925 billion and cutting 47. They seem to go under the radar. So
Laura's back next week, so she'll no doubt take that task on board. Just one thing to say there.
No, I'm not talking about the BBC, Jim. I'm talking about the media generally in terms of the way in which they do address that. They scrutinise the Greens' economic policy to the point where you've just been able to go to a little crib sheet there and go boom, 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 boom. Can I ask you to do the same over reforms economic policies, please?
Yes, I will in due course. But can I just?
That's a very Nigel Farage answer, Jim.
I will do. But I can't waste your time.
As well, we rehearsed this programme so far in advance that I've prepared myself, because you basically get 60 seconds notice in terms of what we're going to discuss. You were able to do that because, it's a serious point, isn't it? Because any time a party from the left starts to become a noise, a voice, a threat, then the Telegraph, the Spectator, the Daily Mail, they come up with all of these scare stories about how much it's going to cost and how many people are going to leave the country and how many entrepreneurs are going to run away. And yet, when Reform came up with that shopping list of promises, which was total and utter fantasy, nobody made the same case. other than your mate Mel Stride. So it is, yeah, it is I know, Jim, but it's not the same, is it, in terms of the way we scrutinise the right and the left? And I do think it's a shame. Good luck to Mr. Polanski. I thought his performances over the last 10 days or so were good. I thought his comment about reaching out to Zara Sultana was interesting. He didn't make the same sort of gesture to Jeremy Corbyn. I think he's seeing that what they need to do is create a young vibe, a dynamic for people under 35, under 40 to say, actually, those guys look good. And when you look at the fragmentation in our political system at the moment, which we've discussed briefly in the past, you could see the Greens potentially having a say in a future coalition. And that's where it would be interesting. So I do think it will give Rachel Reeves food for thought in terms of where she's going economically. And then won't it be interesting when the Greens and Polanski start to comment on the other big debate in this country of immigration and how Labour react to what the Greens are going to be saying on that? Because I can't imagine Polanski's going to be saying we should be rounding up 750,000 and shipping them back home. So yeah, I welcome the Greens coming onto the political space, which for all too long, as I say, has been dominated by the populist right and has not really had a populist left voice. Right, we're going to close the first part of the programme there. When we come back, a few questions. Whilst I've been on my travels over the past few weeks, I've had some of our listeners coming to me and saying, what about this? And how about that? And why do you keep bullying Jim Hancock? So we get into that. We'll get in. And hasn't Joe's cat got a lovely arse? So we get into all that after the break. Stay with us, and we'll lighten things up a bit with a bit of a question time. Okay, welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. And we're going to do a little bit of a question time for a change, because on my travels over the past few weeks, I've been approached by people who very kindly listen to our mutterings on this programme, and I've posed some quite interesting questions. And a few people have asked me this, but Andy McIntyre, who treated me to fantastic hospitality at Manchester City in the Etihad on Saturday, sadly watched my team go down to a 2-0 defeat, but nevertheless, the beer and the food were good. So Andy was the latest to bemoan the fact that we don't have charismatic politicians anymore who can stand on a stage and really wow an audience. And he, not the only one, referenced the recent speeches that everybody was applauding from Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch, and saying, yeah, they were okay, but they weren't the sort of speeches that we used to get at party conferences that would really get the blood flowing and really get people on their feet and punch in the air. And I think you mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Jim, it's 40 years since Neil Kinnock made that incredible speech at, I think it was Bournemouth, wasn't it? Against the militant tendency, a Labour council scuttling around the city, handing out redundancy notices. And
Derek,
hairs going standing up on the back of your neck. Derek Hatton, Eric Heffer walking out of the conference hall, and then Thatcher. The ladies not for turning. There are certain people who are able to command audiences of that era that we will all remember. Tony Benn, and not necessarily leaders and prime ministers. Heseltine. People used to wait for hours for Heseltine's conference speeches. Now, is it a dying art, Jim, or are we looking at things through rose-tinted spectacles?
Well, I remember reporting as a young man the rise of Benjamin Disraeli in the 1870s. I mean, he was a very charismatic man and was always contrasted with Gladstone. Then we had Lloyd George, with his great speeches. So there have been these people and throughout history, and obviously Winston Churchill. I mean, you've mentioned most of the people I've written down here, but and very often these speeches were made under pressure. Michael Foot, he was a great orator and clearly loved presenting things and making classical references and things like that. And, we have to acknowledge that Enoch Powell was a powerful speaker with his classical references as well. And, the particular one that was made under pressure was Dennis Healey in 1976. When he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and was actually given 3 minutes from the conference floor because he wasn't on the national executive, and he said, "I'll tell you the truth. You can boo as much as you like, but I'm going to go back." And so, two or three things: the party conferences, which were often the platform for this sort of thing, have become much more sort of corporate affairs, and with the great exception of the Liberal Democrats, and they really are an exception and take policy making very seriously, they've become sort of fairly ritualized things where fairly cautious speeches are often made. That's one of the things. A more general thing is something we've discussed before, and the questioner will no doubt appreciate this, is that with the social media scrutiny, it's led, I think, a lot of politicians to think, if I sort of let go a bit and really, show my emotions, and it's clipped for eternity on social media, then I won't be in a very good position. And then finally, there's the thing about the people we never go into politics now, that political parties are much more careful about the candidates they choose, with the exception of the Reform Party, who seem to be able to do the reverse and have some highly questionable people in charge. The recruitment process for candidates tends to weed out a lot of the people. I mean, the Lib Dems, used to, and Joe will speak with much more authority than me, used to crucially rely on having charismatic leaders that could raise them above their poll ratings. And, there were a succession of them, Jeremy Thorpe, Charles Kennedy, and of course Paddy. But I'll allow Joe to take up that particular point. But that's my answer to it. It's a shame in many ways. And, you want people to speak with conviction, with colour and with verve. And that's what Polanski is doing to some extent.
Joe?
Well, I think, one of the things is I remember queuing, oh, God knows how many years ago, to go and listen to Tony Benn in the Colston Hall, as it was called then, in Bristol. And it was jammed. I mean, it was like a rock concert. And one of the things that I think politicians don't have much experience of anymore these days is actually talking to on the stump, if you like. I mean, John Major was famous for his soapbox speeches that he had made as an up-and-coming councillor in South London. Very, very few people have that experience of being out, in the street or at a town hall or something like that. And, Jim and I should probably declare an interest here, since we both make considerable, huge amounts of money out of media training people, is that most politicians these days have been media trained within an inch of their lives. So they've lost the passion. And, any performer will tell you, you feed off the audience, whether it's a heckler or the applause or the laughter or the boos or whatever. It gives you the energy and you adapt and you turn. But we are now looking at people who don't have the attention span of the average goldfish, so they're only looking for a 13-second clip. The news is dominated by the clip, so you're always concentrating as the speechwriter or the performer on what's the one that's going to make the 6 o'clock news, or what's the one that's going to get you into trouble. Keir Starmer's Island of Strangers, nobody can remember what else he said in that speech. So I think part of it is a change in the way we absorb and receive political information, if you like. I mean, one of the people who I think never gets mentioned, but who is one of the most charismatic performers I've ever seen live, is Gordon Brown. And I think, in person, in reality, I remember going to an event with Paddy years and years ago, and Gordon turned up and he was late. Obviously, his hair was askew, his tie was askew. He dropped all his papers. It was absolute chaos. He was sort of Shirley Williams in a suit with a Scottish accent. And he was absolutely compelling because he had complete mastery of his brief, but he had real passion. And that sort of, you know, being the son of the Mans and all that, that sense of you are delivering a sermon in a way. And I think, you know, there are very few politicians these days who can do it. And that's why, you know, we've seen certainly in America, it's turned into all the pyrotechnics and the lights and the, you know, all that sort of bedazzle instead of what people say. And, you know, I would just say, yes, we want charismatic politicians up to a point. And yes, Polanski, as we've just said, has got a certain charisma about him, partly because he's new and untested. But, you know, if you want charisma and what you end up with is Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, frankly, I'd go for Clement Attlee anytime.
Yeah, I think, though, that, you see, I never got the Johnson thing. And I don't really get the Farage thing. I think he's competent. I think he's good at grabbing a headline. He's good at a soundbite. But he's not somebody I'd suggest you would go and watch for an hour and he get you on your feet.
Oh, but
he's not that sort of character, is he?
But people do, Frank, and that's the thing. And people, you know, if you're in a hall with Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage, they have got that energy that the crowd, you know, they go with them. And yeah. They've got a sort of it's the sort of rock star quality. It's not really rock star.
It was Johnson's Peppa Pig speech obviously sold it to me. But no, I know what you're saying, but I don't think they compare with some of the names that Jim and yourself have mentioned. And it might just be, I think you've both referenced this, in the age of social media and clips and TikTok, do people get the opportunity or seek the opportunity to speak to those big audiences like you, Joe? I remember queuing up in St. Helens, actually, to see Tony Benn make a speech. You know, in those days, that's what we did. And he was fantastic. In fact, at the time, there was a bomb scare. It was at St. Helens Town Hall. And there was a phone call came through to say that somebody had planted a bomb. And Tony Benn said, well, I don't believe that there's a bomb. So, you know, unless people want to leave, then I suggest we carry on. we just stayed and listened to the speech. When I look back now, I think what a bloody dope I was. We were about 16, I think. Anyway, you know, those were the days, I suppose. And in answer to the question, no, I don't think we have the same sort of charismatic politicians as we have now. And even if it wasn't dominated by TikTok and social media and all of those things we've talked about, I still can't imagine Keir Starmer making the sort of tub-thumping speech that Neil Kinnock used to make all those years ago.
Can I just give you my favourite? Can I just give you my favourite Tony Benn one, which is, it absolutely sums up what you say. There's two sorts of politicians. There's signposts, and that's where you know exactly what they believe in which direction they're taking the party. And then there are weathercocks, and they go around like this with the breeze. What would you like me to believe tomorrow? And that's the two types of politicians that there are.
Very good, Jim. And I did enjoy that Welsh accent there. So
it's almost as good as the Welsh Putin he did earlier, wasn't it?
Let's go on to the next question. Do we think Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch will be facing each other at the next general election as Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition? Joe, we'll start with you this time.
Badenoch, no. Keir Starmer, possibly. I think Badenoch will be gone by this time next year. She may be replaced by Robert Jenrick, which would be an absolute disaster for the Tory party, or they might see some sense and come to the realisation that somebody a little bit more moderate and sensible, like Jim's favourite James Cleverly or even Sir Mel Stride might take them forward to where they're going. Starmer, I think, will hang on because I don't think there is any appetite within the Labour Party for toppling him. But, you know, if things don't improve in the next year, then there will be mutterings and then there will be a leadership challenge. But I think he's safer than she is.
Jim?
I think Badenoch will go, and it will probably be Robert Jenrick, which I agree with Joe would be a big mistake. But I just think the Conservative Party are very exercised by this. And this was a point I was going to make earlier in relation to Labour chasing after reform, which Starmer did to some extent in his speech, even though very few Labour people are joining reform. This ranks are being swelled massively by ex-Conservatives. There aren't many Labour people going over there. They're more attracted the other way. So I think the Conservative Party probably will go with Jenrick because they're obsessed with reform when they ought to go for James Cleverly. But I don't think Badenoch will survive. I just for the sake of being a bit different, I think. Particularly if the economy doesn't improve, you know, and this budget taxes people and we bump along next year and Starmer continues to be accident prone, which he seems to be, I think he will probably conclude he needs to stand down. And the timing of this, of course, will be crucial because then it will either be Wes Streeting, though he has the problem about his own constituency and he's another sort of Londoner, but you know, Shabana Mahmood, depending on whether she can get the boats under control, she could be. I mean, it'd be a hell of a general election. Shabana Mahmood against Nigel Farage, that would be a choice for the nation. But of course, if it's delayed and Labour are reluctant to get rid of their leaders and it comes to 2028, when Mr. Burnham's mayoral responsibilities end, a quick dash to Westminster and a late decision don't entirely rule him out.
Interesting. Okay. I think the answer is no, because we don't think Kemi's going to survive. So Keir's got a chance. Kemi's toast, despite that fabulous conference speech she gave only a couple of weeks ago. So there you go. We always say a week is a long time in politics, don't we? Right. Here's an interesting one. Who decides what and who is on the news? And I will stretch that to say who is on Koonsberg and who is on Question Time and who is on Newsnight. Though these days, I think the answer to that last question is any bugger will turn up. So I'll start with you, Joe. Who decides what's on the news? Because I ask you two this question, of course, because you have both been in newsrooms and have been making these decisions.
Well, it's up to the editor. It'll be, you know, in the BBC and, you know, other big broadcasters. It will be up to the editor of each programme, but overall there will be, you know, director of editorial policy. A lot of it will depend what is in the papers and what's happened overnight. A lot of it will depend on the availability of people. So, you know, let's say you put a bid in for Barack Obama, for instance, who has been doing talks in London. Well, if he says, yeah, I can do next Sunday, then you're not going to say, sorry, we've got Zia Youssef coming on. Can you come back on Wednesday for Newsnight? Nobody will watch you, but it'd be lovely to see you. So, you know, it's a sort of a mixed bag. And Jim and I have both been in the position where we, you know, you have to sell your story, basically, whether you're a broadcaster or a newsprint journalist, to the editor who will go, yeah, but nobody's interested in that. I mean, you know, a case in point is this weekend, ever since the story broke about Prince Andrew, it has dominated the news. Now, it's not a constitutional crisis. It's based on a book that is coming out tomorrow. It is a terrible story. It's deeply distressing for the king, but does it really warrant the amount of coverage it has got? In my view, the answer is no. But of course, the other thing that is hugely influential today is a little bit like we were saying about politicians and speaking. It's about, will it get viewers? Will it get clicks? And certainly in terms of the commercial side of broadcasting and newspapers, it's the clicks they want, not the context or the long form interview.
James?
Well, first of all, I'll sort of just do the boring bit of the sort of the structure of a newsroom, which might help this conversation. I mean, there is often, if I take the BBC, there's a woman called Turness, who's the sort of director of news, so she's right at the top of this, reporting more or less to the Director General of the BBC, but they only have an overview really of editorial policy, and only some really controversial issues come up to them. If you take the sort of programme levels that Joe and I were working on, the important thing to say is that viewers, and quite naturally, think that the reporters, even the correspondents, decide these things, but we don't. We are often what I call as the sort of the voices on a stick. We have an input, but the really powerful people on a program deciding what's going to go on Newsnight or on News at 10 are the editors. And there's an editorial conference where the reporters are present, but there are editors and assistant editors as well. And they will be having a focus on exactly what Joe says, things that are going to interest the public. It's two things are important. What are the public caring about? Health, education, things like that. And crucially, to introduce the item, can we find a good case study, real people? People were always saying to me, find some real people for your political story, Jim, so that and if you look at a package on the news, a report, it doesn't start off with a politician pontificating. It always starts off with Mary's had cancer for 3 months and can't get an appointment and all that sort of thing. So that's the sort of thing that drives it. The last thing I want to say is that, it was always unpopular in our office, but inevitably the case that even now, very often on the sort of BBC and ITV, things are driven by what's in the papers. And it used to irritate me because, you come up with an original story, but the newspapers did remain quite important in terms of the electronic media's sort of coverage. Things are changing now because, of course, everybody holds their editorial conference in the morning and puts out their podcasts and so on, and that's probably a good democratic thing. The cacophony is taking time for old timers like myself to get used to, but this is the new environment. But that's the sort of decision process that is generally taken. But I do take Joe's point that sometimes the media gets carried away with a particular thing, and everybody's racing to get another expert on Prince Andrew's life and all this sort of stuff, and it can drift away from the public. But that's generally how things actually get on the radio and television.
The other thing I would just say briefly is that real news is actually quite rare. Those news in its proper sense is stuff that is unexpected. And so much of the structure of a programme will be based on, well, we know so-and-so is making a speech, we know there's an announcement about this, the CBI are releasing these figures, or X, Y, and Z, Trump's doing this. So you've got those sort of, if you like, those sort of structures in place, the outline of what is happening, and then you get something, as has happened since we've been on air, this massive website outage which has collapsed banks and Amazon and everything else, but hopefully not the Downtown Den podcast. But there is very little that is new, and you are always up against the fact that certainly domestically, people aren't that interested in foreign affairs. And, we do have had good coverage, I think, of the Gaza war and Ukraine, but we don't get any coverage of what's going on in Sudan. We get a little bit of coverage of what's going on in France, but it's more about the jewel heist on the Louvre rather than the political shenanigans that are going on. So there's always, and we've got this obsession with America. The Guardian has got more reporters in Washington than it has in the whole of Africa.
Yeah.
For instance.
Interesting. Let me ask you a question. This has just occurred to me because I was reading an excellent newspaper actually called The New World.
Oh yes, very good.
European.
Thoroughly recommend it.
And they have a page called Rats in a Sack, which is always entertaining. So let me ask you, seriously, why this didn't get high-level media coverage. Nathan Gill seems to be of little interest to the BBC and the right-wing media because questions about what the senior reform figures knew and when about the disgraced former MEP's links to Russia have failed to be asked. On September the 26th, Gill pleaded guilty to 8 counts of bribery, relating to speeches he made in favour of Russia in the European Parliament. He was Reform's former leader in Wales and was a close confidant of Nigel Farage for years in UKIP and the Brexit Party. Now, I sort of vaguely have seen this story on probably the New Statesman and the New World, but it's not something that I've heard on ITV, on BBC. Don't know whether you've covered it on GB News, Joe?
Funnily enough, no. But it was mentioned on Any Questions on Radio 4 on Friday evening when Ben Wright was standing in for Alex, can't remember her name, but anyway, he was the presenter and the show was coming from Wales, and he did do quite a big piece on it, and they'd got a Reform person on. And I have seen coverage in some papers. Now, Gill has not yet been sentenced. I think sentencing is due the week after next, first week of November. And one would hope that more comes out once the sentencing is done, not because of contempt of court or anything, because he's pled guilty. But it is an opportunity for the newspapers and certainly the BBC, for sure, to do a bit of background on this. And I noticed today there's a piece in The Eye from Ian Birrell about Nigel Farage's links, or his relationship with Russia. So I think it is there, but you're absolutely right, Frank. It's not the sort of thing that's getting the coverage that it would do if it was somebody from one of the, Labour or the Tories.
Is that because it's, not to be disparaging about Wales, but is it because it's Wales, Jim? Because even when you consider the furore and the spotlight that was put on the SNP, for example, over there, the allegations of corruption there, that was quite big news. Is Wales seen as a bit of a backwater for the Beeb and other media outlets, do you think?
I don't think so. I mean, I've seen quite a lot of references to the fact that the Senate elections are coming up next year, more coverage than normal because of this big reform challenge. I think that's to be fair. And I have seen some picture. The BBC have got, and ITV have got quite an embarrassing picture of this Gill man standing next to Farage, walking along from their time in the European Parliament together. So there have been references to it. I'm not in any way mitigating it, because what I'm now going to say was on the BBC West political programme yesterday, but they had Aaron Banks on, who you'll remember, who's a Reform character, and they did quite extensively put this to him. And it's interesting, he said, a few bad apples in the barrel. And as far as the more general charge, which I do think needs more examination about Reform's attitude to Russia, because he maintained Farage's claim that it was a mistake for these countries to join NATO, and therefore, by implication, we were provoking Russia. But he then said, and of course, Farage has called for the shooting down of any Russian planes that enter Polish airspace. So that's what they're saying about it. But I think probably we'll see what coverage it gets afterwards. I mean, he's not a front rank politician, but in terms of the scrutiny of Reform, which you are demanding, rightly demanding, on their economic policy or on their attitude to Russia, they are going to be increasingly subjected to this. And we haven't got time now, but Joe could tell you a lot more of the scrutiny that they're coming under with regard to the running of Kent County Council.
Yeah, and I noticed there was a piece on the front page of the Sunday Times, I think it was yesterday, about a corruption investigation into Farage's wife. So I think it's always the way, isn't it? You start to put your head above the parapet and people start to take you seriously as a political party, and all of a sudden this scrutiny will follow. So we'll see. I think it's interesting that the BBC are being referred to as right-wing media. So there you go, James. A little bit of work to be done from your former employers, methinks. Anyway, that was quite fun, doing a little bit of a question time. So if anybody else sees Jim, Joe or myself on our travels and you want to put a question to us, then we'll happily take a few from time to time on the podcast. Lots going on, of course, in foreign affairs this week. We will turn our attention to those matters in next week's podcast, because we have reached our 60-minute or so mark, and our producer Francesca has much more important downtown work to be getting on with. So we will say goodbye for now. Thanks for listening as ever. Have a fabulous 7 days.